So I'm admittedly not the best 3D camera solver. We've done a bunch of projects with tracked cameras and I'm always experimenting with different ways of doing it for different projects. I recently posted a TikTok that sparked some heated discussion about which camera tracking method was the best. So it occurred to me that I could make a comparison video and get to the bottom of it. My strategy here is looking for a method that's the most straightforward for getting you a usable camera track. And all of these methods can work really well if you spend a lot of time digging into them. I'm curious what's the best mix of speed, accuracy, and ease of use when you're working with it for the first time. We are going to be taking a look at camera tracking inside of Blender 3D, Geo Tracker, which is a Blender add-on, After Effects, Boris FX Mocha Pro, and Fusion inside of DaVinci Resolve. We're also going to be talking about how much each of these costs and how worth it each one is for the price. Obviously, we're comparing them to each other. Let's get into it. First off, we have Mocha Pro from Boris FX. And those After Effects users will know that there is a Mocha version inside of After Effects, but that is not the same as Mocha Pro unless you are paying for Mocha Pro and you've installed Mocha Pro for After Effects. But this is not the default Mocha that is in After Effects. And you can get a free trial for Mocha Pro. That's what I'm going to be running for this test. This is the video that we're going to be tracking to. Shot on my iPhone. Pretty straightforward. It's not the easiest to track with, but I think it's a decent test and it covers a couple different scenarios. So this is our UI and you just press this solve button to start with. You get your little progress bar up here and we can scrub through. We can see that we have little dots on each of our spots. Right now we are at an average solve error of 0.8, which is pretty good. It's not great. It's not perfect, but for minimal effort, 0.8 is pretty good. And all that I've really adjusted is this right here a little bit. I just changed our small blip, big blip. And I'll put a link in the description for good tutorials for all these because this video is not necessarily a tutorial video. I just want to show enough of the user experience for you to kind of get a glimpse of what it's like and kind of give some context. But you'll have to watch a specific tutorial or any one of these particular methods to really get in depth. And you can go ahead and just export camera right away. So very straightforward. Very easy. But before exporting camera, we're going to set an origin point. So I've just picked a point here, make origin, we have our origin plane, and we can just export camera data. I have been exporting FBX to import it into Blender. So let's check out how that looks. And so after importing the camera in, this is our result. I think it did awesome. I threw in a little plane for what it looks like when an object is attached to the meter itself. Our origin point is where it's supposed to be. I threw in a little cube for an object kind of at the base of the pole here. And I mean, it's tracking. It's tracking, like I said, it's like a 0.8 or 0.9 solve error. So for that, it's good. For that, it is good. And this is what our scene looks like. Our camera's moving around in three-dimensional space as if it was our little hand holding the phone or the camera. One notable thing here also is that when you imported the camera, at least in my case, it did not change the focal length. So it had the focal length as 30 or something, and I had to change it to 20 to get it to actually match up. That is one kind of noticeable thing that I guess maybe did not work perfectly in this workflow, but ultimately I did figure it out and it looks really great. And for our rating for Mocha Pro, speed, I'm giving us 9 out of 10. You can just press the solve button and get a result right away. And then you can export the camera data. You should set the origin point and you should set the plane first, but you can straight up just go solve, export camera data. So speed, extremely fast. Accuracy, I'm giving it an 8 out of 10. There's a slight bump or a slight slip in the tracking, especially for the meter. And that could definitely just be user error, but I would prefer for that not to happen. We could also work on whittling down our solve error, which would probably fix that. Overall, accuracy, 8 out of 10. Very accurate. Could be more accurate, probably, I guess, but I feel like that's a really good rating. Ease of use, 10 out of 10. Worked awesome. Our next contestant coming in from the Adobe camp is After Effects. After Effects is weighing in at $23 a month. Not as expensive as Mocha Pro, still pretty expensive. However, After Effects is something that a lot of us have for other reasons already. We're already paying for it, or we already have the full Adobe suite. So for me, didn't have to pay anything extra to learn how to do this in After Effects. And I believe there are still free trials of After Effects if you want to try this out and not quite jump into buying it yet. Another super notable thing about this method is you need to add a script into After Effects to be able to export this data to Blender. And you need an add-on for Blender to be able to import that camera data. I'll put a link in the description to a good tutorial that walks you through how to do all that. I'll also put a link to the script, and the add-on. But they're very easy to install. It's very straightforward. Once you do it, it just kind of works the way that it's supposed to. So it's not a big, huge roadblock, but it is a thing. It is like one more thing to have to do. So in After Effects, you can literally just go up here to animation and track camera with your footage selected. And now it's analyzing the background. It's doing whatever its thing is. It's tracking. It's going through each individual frame. Pretty quick for getting started. Very, very fast to get into it. Also, it helps that I know how to use After Effects in general, but even that being said, very fast. And we have our result. It gives us all these little markers. Again, they're in the spots that they're supposed to be in. I guess they're not slipping around. Pretty straightforward. And then you have your advanced tab. A lot of people like this detailed analysis. I have not done that yet for this one. Our average solve error here is 0.49 pixels. I don't know if I mentioned this before. The solve error, you want that to be lower. The lower the solve error, the better. Sorry if I didn't mention that already. So this solve error, without changing any settings at all, is lower than the solve error from Mocha without changing any settings at all. So whatever that means to you. Then the next step here would be selecting some of our points on the ground. You can right click on that, create solid and camera. Now you have an object inside of your 3D scene. I'm just going to make this bigger for the sake of being able to kind of see if it looks like the right thing is happening here. You can play it back and you can kind of see, like, does that feel like it's stuck in the right spot? To which I would say absolutely yes. This is the method that I originally used for making this animation. So I already knew how it would work for this one specifically. And this is the one that kind of got a bit of a response on TikTok and the reason for making this whole video. But this was kind of my go-to in the first place. And then from there, we have our camera, we have our solid. You can select both of those. And this is after we have our script added in. Go to scripts and export composition data to JSON, and then just export. And that's how easy this can be. And this is what we get. I should have set the orientation because everything's like a little bit sideways. And even with the origin point being off a little bit, this is the result. You can see it's pretty stuck. I didn't have to change any scale of anything. I just had to change the orientation so it's vertical, but otherwise it's looking pretty good. A little bit slippery on the floor, a little tiny bit, but it's pretty good. And as far as ease of use, very easy. All right, and what's my rating for After Effects? I give the speed for After Effects 9 out of 10. As you saw, you can get a result super quick. As you also saw, accuracy, I'm going to give a 7 out of 10. Still ended up a little bit slippery. Again, we could refine it and get it to work a little bit better, but as far as just surface level, like the quickest thing you can get, not as accurate as Mocha. At the end of the day, you just don't have as much control to change additional settings for the camera track as you would in some of these other programs like Mocha or Blender. Ease of use, I would say 9 out of 10. After you install the script and after you install the add-on, very, very easy. As you saw, 9 out of 10. Our next contestant is Fusion inside of DaVinci Resolve. This is a one-time payment of $300, which does sound crazy. I guess the longer that you use it, the cheaper it becomes. But to be able to use this feature, you have to pay the $300 or you already paid it. You're already a DaVinci Studio user. So all these other ones have free trials, so you can try out this feature specifically, but you can start to do it. You can add in the camera tracking node, but then it tells you that you have to pay to actually use it. So the way this goes in Resolve, once you have your footage in there, you add a camera tracker node. It goes in between your footage and your media out. Then you get these options up here. So without changing any settings, you can just boom, click auto track. We have some points. We're going through the whole thing. And again, we can look at our points and see where we're going. I haven't changed any settings. Looking pretty good. Go to camera, have more settings that I'm not changing. And then you can just straight up go for solve. See what we get. All right. So default, we get a solve error of 2.5, which I would say is not good. So I'm going to change a couple settings and get us down to a solve error under 1 so we can really compare. But, you know, this is part of the comparison. Okay, so I just did 2 things. I got us down to a solve error of 0.36. One thing that I did was trim the clip because I realized that in the other ones I had trimmed the very end because a bus goes by and the shadow seems to confuse things a little bit. So I trimmed it like the other ones, and that got us to right around like 1.1, which was still higher than the After Effects tracking and the Mocha tracking. The other thing I did was still the default, but I ran the solve option to clean tracks by filter. So that got us down to a solve error of 0.35. So we went from the least accurate solve error all the way up to the most accurate solve error very quickly. So whatever that means to you, we'll proceed. So from there, we can make our way over to export, and you can just click export. It gives you this somewhat confusing cluster of nodes. And what we want is an FBX exporter. Connect that in. We have some options here and render all savers. And now we can pop it open in Blender. And I ended up setting a ground plane in Fusion because you kind of have to do that. This is what our result ended up looking like with our ground plane. And then from the camera view, this is where we are. So it's stuck on there pretty well. It's what we want it to be. It's a little bit slippery. Again, importing the camera data as FBX into Blender, I keep having this like focal length problem. So I have to go manually change the focal length, which is fine. Just not feeling as straightforward as After Effects, because After Effects, I don't have to change the focal length. It imports the focal length perfectly. And that kind of ends up being a pretty big, important deal. There's that. I like After Effects better in that way, but I do like Fusion better because it has more settings to refine things. And maybe I'm refining it to the point where it's like not good anymore, but After Effects still kind of easier. Fusion inside of DaVinci Resolve. For speed, I'm going to give a 7 out of 10 because you can get a result pretty fast. I just could not get a usable result fast. If it's not a completely usable result, I feel like that doesn't count. Give it a 7. It still is fast. Maybe it's just me. Accuracy, I'm giving it a 6 out of 10 because I just was unable to really get a great accurate result. A big part of that is having to do the FBX import into Blender. Yeah, I tweaked the focal length. I tweaked different things. I could not get it perfect. Leave a comment if I'm blowing it and there's like some obvious thing I need to change. But as far as trying to use it in a straightforward way, I could not get it as easily as these other programs. And then all of that leading up to, as you could predict, I'm going to give it like a 5 for ease of use. Not very easy to get into the first time, especially if you're not familiar with like the Resolve Fusion workflows. There's the node thing in the beginning. The tracking is pretty straightforward. Then there's the node thing again at the end. There's the glitch where I can't export anything. And then when I do export it, I have these problems with the FBX. So ease of use is a 5, unfortunately. Our next contestant is Geo Tracker from Keen Tools, weighing in at a lean $18 a month. And Geo Tracker is actually the first tool that I ever used for camera tracking. And generally the way that it works, you're utilizing an object and you're kind of lining up the geometry of that object with whatever you're tracking. So you're not dealing with tracking points. So as someone who was unfamiliar with tracking points in the beginning, lining up geometry and having it track that way was much easier for me to understand and get into. And again, I'm using this as a Blender add-on, so all of this is happening inside of Blender. You start off, you establish an object. In this case, I'm using a cube. Ideally, you would use like a perfect model of this parking meter, and that's why this method does not work that well for this scene. I tried it with just the pole, but if what we're manipulating is not the pole, you end up with this perfectly tracked pole and like the floor is slipping. So I wanted to track something that was going to give us the best track for the meter because that's what we need to be interacting with. So I started out with this cube that's going to get like stuck to the meter, tracked to the meter. So you load in your footage, it analyzes it. You can use a free trial of this again, which is cool. Set your focal length. I think it'll do an auto focal length. You can choose if you're tracking geometry or a camera. The geometry tracking is very cool. I know it's not what we're talking about in this. The geometry tracking would be like if you were tracking this phone and the phone was doing this in a frame and you're tracking just for the phone itself, not for the whole scene. Very cool for that. That's kind of the ideal situation for this tool. But for the sake of this test, we're going to try to utilize it for this. We're going to select our clip. For geometry, we're choosing our cube. We have our existing camera. Then we're going to analyze. All right, now that our clip has been analyzed, we can go to start pin mode. And the way that this works, we want to line up the corners of our geometry with parts of this like real life object that we're tracking. So this corner back here, I'd like to track with that. So that's probably enough. Kind of the fewer, the better, because it starts to get confused. Maybe I'll line that up there. And from then I'm going to track the scene backwards for where it is. And you can see it trying to stick to those spots in like a 3-dimensional way, whatever that means. And I mean, it's looking pretty good. It's pretty solid. You can kind of preview it back. It's looking pretty good. And that's one of the things that I initially liked about this process is when things are kind of going wrong, then you can go back and like fix the keyframe, like a general keyframe workflow. You can fix the keyframes in a geometry way. Then I'm going to try to track the rest of it forward to the end. And then you can kind of watch it back and refine it. You definitely get lost at a certain point because, again, this is not like the ideal scenario for this. Pretty close. We get lost around like 280. So what we would do in those areas where we're lost is we just kind of realign our existing points, maybe add new points, drag them around, and track forward again. This is not the ideal scene and the ideal use for this, but this is a way that you can do it. Like you could also do it by tracking the floor. There are different things you could do. And this is like where I was able to get with this method. So the cube is tracked to the meter. Get a little bit of our perspective shift. It's a little bit awkward because realistically it would probably just be something that's like stuck to the front of it. But this is a potential method for these things. I know I'm selling it pretty hard here. And so this is a scene that kind of makes more sense for this method, just so you have context. So we have our shape. We're just going to drag our pins over to where they should be. So now that we're lined up, we're going to track it forward, see what we get. And then I'm going to go ahead and go like back to our 3D mode. And this is our track that we get. So I could still refine it. I could still tweak it, but it gets us a track. You know, it animates the camera. So this is what it looks like in our wider scene. We get our animated camera. So just it works really, really well kind of with like basic geometry when you need to track geometry specifically. And if that's easier for you, this could be a method. This is like how that would look tracked out. And it's on there. It's working. For certain projects, it makes sense. It works. Just an option because it was helpful for me. Kind of expensive. All right, for Keen Tools Geo Tracker, our speed score, I'm giving it a 6 out of 10. Maybe that's a little bit harsh because it can be fast. The one that I just showed you went kind of fast, but overall, it kind of can be a slower way to do things. Not that it's bad. And it can be helpful in certain situations, but I think it's slower than our other methods for sure. Accuracy, I'm giving it an 8 out of 10 for the right scene. Because you have a lot of ways to tweak it and it does track really well. Ease of use, I'm giving it an 8 out of 10. It's a very easy workflow to learn and to troubleshoot initially. It also preloads and like presets up your Blender scene from just your clip. You don't have to manually set up some of those elements of your scene that you do in all these other methods. So I think that makes it a little more beginner friendly as well. And now it's time, the moment you've all been waiting for, our final contestant, weighing in at a crushing $0 for free forever. It is Blender 3D. That's right. You heard it here first. $0. It's Blender 3D. Camera solving in Blender is not as straightforward as a lot of these other programs, which I imagine makes it better. But I do have to take that into consideration. But I've done this in Blender a bunch of times and it still is not like easy for me and it still doesn't feel that straightforward. So I did some tracking stuff, changed a couple things as for best results according to some YouTube videos that I watched, which I will link in the description. And we have our little confusing, scary graph down here. Now I'm going over to solve. So I'll just leave it default and solve camera motion. Let's see what we get. Ooh, solve error of 75 is brutal. And after much deliberation, I got us down to a solve error of 0.46. The settings are nowhere near default. It is a whole thing. This is why personally, Blender is not my first choice for camera tracking, even though the camera track ends up getting imported into Blender. So having it all natively inside Blender, all beginning to end would make sense. But this is like the issue that I keep having just objectively with the same project. It's easier to track with something else, but we'll keep going. Solve error of 0.46, which is good. I had to clean some tracks. I had to refine back and forth. But here we are. So let us set up tracking scene. I mean, so it's all working. We have a little cube that's stuck on there. We have our floor. We have our origin point. This one took me the longest. of all of them. I did not have to double check a tutorial, which I guess I probably should have done, but I mean, this is the first time that I've done it from memory. Every other time I've had to like refresh some part of my mind when I'm using this method. So there's that. But I mean, just within the context of this experiment, absolutely this one took the longest. And maybe it's this scene. But the other methods did not have a problem with this scene. But I'm relieved that I even got it. And like I said, it's nowhere near default. So that definitely hurts the ease for the beginner, in my opinion. However, one benefit of doing this in Blender, there's no importing or exporting. You can set your origin, your floor, wall, set your axes, set your scale right here. You can watch all of it update up there. And then you can just be straight into your project and doing all your Blender stuff. So that's a benefit when you're working in Blender. I'm not sure. I'm not sure that the time really weighs out. It's still, to me, is fastest to just do After Effects to Blender. And for my final ratings for our final program here, Blender 3D, for speed, I'm giving it a 7 out of 10. The program itself works very quickly. It does the tasks quickly. It's just, it takes more to get anything to work. And you saw it here, side-by-side comparison with all these different programs. Blender was the one that took the most work to get us to a solve error below 1 or even around 1. Accuracy, I'm saying 9 out of 10. You have so many settings to dial it in. And it's, in my experience, it's almost like it doesn't work until you start to really get dialed, and then you can get a result that's super, super accurate. For ease of use, I'm giving Blender a 7 out of 10 because I've done this a bunch of times. It's still confusing. So for somebody who's a beginner, the chances of you like watching one tutorial one time and hopping into Blender and getting this to work right on a consistent basis, or even just getting it to work right in the first place, kind of a large barrier. Even to be able to follow the tutorials correctly, there's kind of a barrier of being able to use Blender and kind of understanding what's going on enough. Overall, maybe there are too many parameters. I mean, again, it helps with the accuracy. So I guess maybe people aren't treating Blender like it's the most professional tool ever, but for this particular purpose, it feels super, super pro. There's so much stuff to work with to the point where I think the ease of use actually goes down and it becomes super confusing. Blender 3D. So overall, I had the easiest time using Mocha Pro. It's also the most expensive. I'm not sure if I really need all of the functionality to justify that price every single month, but definitely the easiest to use. For right now, I will probably stick to After Effects, and I'm trying to get more into the DaVinci Resolve universe in general. I would love to transition into using just Fusion. For now, the easiest way that I'm already paying for is just to use After Effects. Blender is free, so things that don't work for me in After Effects, I'll usually just go to Blender. But again, all of these are really good options. They all work. Let me know which one you prefer and why. And of course, if I miss anything, if I'm like completely off base and I'm completely blowing it, let me know. Genuinely, my goal here is to really see what works the best. And as always, I appreciate the likes. I appreciate the comments. Thank you everybody that watches the videos, and I will catch you next time.